Well, hello everyone. This is week two at SOC 201. You guys made it through the first week. It's a good thing. The hard part, I think a lot of classes is just getting, just kind of getting situated, knowing what's going on. So you've made it through the first week. Still working on the discussion boards though. Remember, have your original post and then to go back over and make a comment on some other peers by, the second Sunday. And then you have the discussion post for this week as well. So hopefully you're enjoying those. Yeah, I really encourage you to really engage in those discussion boards and, uh, you know, comment on each other, challenge each other, add to each other's postings there, and make that a real meaningful experience for you. Well, I want to make these videos between 12 and 15 minutes, somewhere along in there. So let me just kind of I give you a roadmap for chapters 3 and 4. Just highlight a couple things I think are really important. I think will be helpful for you as you move through the chapters and the assignment for the week. So basically, the first couple chapters, you got a history of sociology, the three main theories of sociology, and now you'll see that throughout the course of the term, some chapters more than others, but really be applying the ideas of the three sociological theories to different areas of culture and society. There's a lot of resources out there for the three theories, a lot of different videos, introductory videos, articles, whatever, strikes your fancy. If you, just be grounded in those theories. The more grounded you are, I think the content will be easier and make a lot more sense for the class. And if I can help out in any way, let me know for sure. So let's talk about, culture, sort of culture and culture from a sociological perspective. One thing about human behavior, looking at from a social science perspective or looking at it just, from an analytical perspective, is that an awareness that human behavior is learned. Everything is learned behavior. Even something that seems like very instinctual or reactionary or just something that is a bodily function. There's social influences that are going on around that. So I can just give you a few different examples. Some people may say, well, males are more violent because they're not conditioned. It's just biologically determined because of hormonal levels and neurological things that are going on, physiological aspects of difference between males and females. You can poke a lot of holes in that and sort of, definitely see that that's not the case, that undermines or minimizes the role that social forces come into play in shaping behavior. If we look at, if it was true that males were more violent, that's biologically determined, you'd see that levels of violence across all societies, across all times, for males compared to females would be very stationary, that it wouldn't change significantly. What we see is that there's a lot of cross-cultural variability, there's a lot of historical variability, there's changes based on a lot of different factors, and the focus is really trying to understand what are those social factors that are going on that are helping to influence behavior. I'll give you a real quick, I think a funny example, another example about how something that may seem natural is actually a lot of learned behavior. Many years ago, when our two boys were young, we had family friends that had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. And one day we were hanging out, and all of a sudden, one of the boys came over, and he was probably, I don't know, like 8 years old. There were 2 boys were 8 and 5, and the girl was 3 or something like that. 2 boys came over, and they're laughing. They're saying, "Hey, Missy she's doing something funny." And we're like, "Well, what's going on?" So we walked over and saw that the girl, who was probably about 3 years old, maybe 4, she was going to the bathroom. She was peeing, and she was peeing with an arc. She had watched her brothers go to the bathroom, going outside, and she saw there was an arc on their pee, so she was trying to do the same thing. And I just thought it was funny, it was interesting. It's like, even something that's such a natural function as going to the bathroom, there's a lot of social influences that are going on with something like that. So the focus, so it's unpackaging and saying, okay, human behavior is all learned. Okay, what are the forces that are going on that are helping shape that behavior? So that gets us into culture. Culture, different analysis of culture. We're going to talk about the 3 theoretical perspectives of culture, then talk about a couple different specific things. So we have, the functionalist perspective, Emil Durkheim, and the functionalist perspective, laying out the idea that society is built on a consensus of values or needs a consensus of values for society's stability. It's looking at institutions, looking at how institutions function for for the betterment of society or for the stability of society itself or of a social system. Think about functionalism, think about a biological organism, and that's sort of the metaphor to sort of carry forward in thinking about functionalism. In fact, that's what the roots of functionalism come from, is from Durkheim applying the ideas of biology from a natural world to the social world. And that's kind of the main tenets of functionalism are about that. Conflict theory is, I think conflict theory is an optimistic theory. It's often misconstrued or misunderstood. Both functionalism and conflict theory are utopic theories. Sort of they have a vision of how to make for a better society or a more stable society for functionalism. For conflict theory, a more equitable society. I think, at the end of the day, Marxist perspective is extremely optimistic about humans and human behavior, but is highly concerned about the conditions and who's controlling the conditions in which we operate in. And that's kind of the real key issue. Functionalism, the position and the idea is that the values that we have in society are there for creating that stability, that we need core values in order to create unity and solidarity. This is why every nation has a flag. Flags are wrapped up with all kinds of symbols, history, and the flag becomes a way to develop national identity, something that's important for unity. Conflict theory is going to be the question of who's controlling the images. What are those? Are those images empowering images, or are they images that demean and devalue certain individuals or certain groups? We can look at Disney films. Disney films are ripe with analysis of a lot of racism, sexism, classism built in within the movies themselves. And that symbolic culture is really powerful because it starts to shape it's not only a reflection of things that are going on in culture, but starting to shape the ways in which people think about particular social groups or particular racial groups, gender groups, in this particular case. And there's a lot of power in that. So the ability to control images is, at the end of the day, the ability to control the way people think and ultimately control their behavior. So big macro level, functionalism, conflict theory, interactionism is the micro level. It's interested in how do we develop meaning? How do we develop understanding? It's more of an individual level, but individuals are assimilating culture into their experience. So that if we look at whatever it might be, I'll give you a couple different examples when we talk about social construction of reality. So one of the ideas of interactionism is that we build meaning, right? Nothing has any inherent meaning in it. The history of marijuana is fascinating, right? Changing meaning. And it's fascinating how over the last 10 years that we've really changed significant meaning about marijuana in a lot of different communities. To go from marijuana would cause you to be insane, to commit murder, rape, all these different kind of things during the marijuana panic of the 1920s, 1930s, to where we're at today. Marijuana, you could argue that with different cultivation practices and different technologies that the level of THC is a lot higher today than it was before. In some ways, it'd be more dangerous and more of a menace. But back in the 1920s and 30s, there's a lot of stuff going on that's influencing this idea that marijuana is causing people to commit murder and commit crime and commit rape. That'd be unheard of today, to have that kind of an idea. Marijuana hasn't changed in terms of its properties. What's changed is humans assigning different meaning to it. So that's important to keep in mind. So part of that interactionist perspective, a couple different things. One is this idea of social construction of reality, and the idea of social construction of reality is that we build meaning. So to understand something and the way we assign meaning to something, you have to understand the history behind it, have to understand the process in which we've decided to assign particular meaning on things, and to understand that meaning is negotiable, that meaning changes over time. The meaning has, even though it's arbitrary, what kind of meaning we assign to something, it has real power because we believe this to be true. So, for example, marijuana, the social construction of marijuana in the 1920s, constructed a reality that, led by politicians, political leaders, people in the community, there's a lot of different things going on. I won't go into all the stuff of why, but people started to believe that marijuana was going to be causing these things. Well, then people start to look for these things. It starts to become, they start to see it, they start to react to it in different ways. So it's because they're responding to the way they've interpreted the world. They're not responding based on the way the world actually is. And that's kind of an important point, is that we respond to, before we behave, we interpret. So we're given a sign. For example, we're given a symbol. We're given something happens like marijuana. It's like a symbol. it's a yeah, it's a symbol, right? Before we respond and assign meaning to that, we have to interpret it. Okay, what does it mean? And then once we make that interpretive assigned meaning, then our behavior follows that. So that is really kind of an essential kind of thing to keep in mind, is that we are influenced by our perceptions of the way that the world is. I'll give you a couple different examples. One of them that I really encourage you to watch is the video available on Confederate monuments, a TED Talk given. And then there's an article on there too from NPR looking at the history of Confederate monuments, when were they erected, and sort of the perspective being offered there. There's a lot of emotion involved in Confederate monuments, and over the last few years in particular, I think it's fascinating to pull back the layers a little bit and look at the history of Confederate monuments. When were they erected? Where were they erected? What are some of the potential reasons they were? And I think he created a really good case that Confederate monuments were established as a way to maintain white domination in the South. It was a response to progressive movements for racial progress in terms of racial equity. It was a kickback. It was a backlash against movement towards greater racial equity in the South. Now, the history may be that, but man, there's so many different reasons why people assign different meaning. I think in some ways, for some individuals recently, that the Confederate flag and the Confederate monuments were less to do about the monument than having to do with about political position, about political identity. There are a lot of other things that make it very complicated in terms of the ways in which people are assigning meaning. And then you start to look at too, okay, well, who's influencing and who's shaping that meaning? I think the communities that we live in, our social influences in terms of peers, families, different connections, those have a significant influence, of course, on the way that we view the world. And it's that social construction of reality that becomes key and important, and kind of keep in mind through a lot of the stuff that we'll investigate in this class, is being aware that meaning changes across time. Who's involved in shaping that meaning becomes really important, and what's the impact, I think, is really fascinating to look at as well. I'll give you another example, that probably 2 years ago is the first time I heard the term cisgender, CIS, gender, looking at where a person's sexual identity and their gender identity are aligned. So I'm a cisgender male. My sexual identity and my gender identity are in alignment. That terminology is it's contemporary terminology. It did not exist in common public discourse before a few years ago. So if you're looking at languages, cultures are moving. Languages as a reflection of things that are going on in our societies. And they're also a reflection of power relations, of who's shaping the language that we use. Language is also shaping the way that we view the world. So we see transgender, for example, another terminology that's been around for a much longer period of time, but it's entered the public discourse much more significantly over the last 5 years or so. And I think that's another great example about how, our meanings that we attach to transgender are fundamentally have shifted over the last 5-10 years. Sexual orientation, sexual identity, moving and changing. What's fascinating, fun, interesting, exciting to look at are the influences that go into shaping those ideas, and then how they get internalized into us in terms of our own identities, and then how they influence our perceptions of the world itself. So, I don't know, those are some things to keep in mind there. What else might I note here? That's about, it for now. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of provide you a couple different key ideas about culture. There's a few different videos that I put out there that I think are really fascinating. One of them is on food, from Peter Menzel, and him and his significant other did a project. They've done a few projects, photojournalistic projects of going around the world looking at different things. One of their books is about food, called Hungry Planet, going around the world and looking at what people eat, and then looking at things like, well, how much do they spend when they eat, who are they eating with in terms of, is it nuclear family, extended family, and all these different kind of things. If you get a chance, check out the book at the library. It's a fascinating book. He's got another one on, or they have another one on shopping and mass consumption around the world. That's another fascinating one. There's a lot of great value in that. Before I end today, just one more thing, I guess, and I was looking at my notes here, is the difference between idealized culture and practice culture, I think, is really important. Idealized culture is what we believe it to be or what we hope it to be, and practice culture is basically the way it is. Now, easy to understand, I think conceptually, now the great kind of mystery, fun, and challenge is when we see it sort of getting played out, or that difference between the two. There's been a lot of work on a nostalgic look of American family life. If you ask, for some people, like identify when was the best time period for American families, they identify the 1950s. That's kind of what, I don't know, we did for a while, at least, that, like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. During the buildup of the suburbs in the 1950s was sort of this idyllic version or vision of what the American family life was like. Well, the practice reality is that American families have always been diverse in terms of like experiences, economic differences have always made a difference. This idea of a two-parent family and one parent staying at home is an idealized version that came out of the 1950s, post-World War II, suburbia America, where we had the economic opportunity to do that. There's a lot of gender kind of realities, gender construction realities that help facilitate that, as well as pre-feminist movement or third wave feminist movement that on a provided a context that was more likely to happen. So it's important to keep in mind sort of this idealized culture versus the practice culture. And sometimes there's a strong difference between the two. We idealized, a lot of things, and that's not bad. It's neither bad nor good. I mean, idealized culture is sort of where we live part of our lives. I think it's important to keep in mind sort of, but what's the reality that we live in, so we don't run into a situation where we're imposing a particular vision and idea that's not reality, and that can get us into some funky situations, and it can create very significant difficulties when we're trying to address and manage particular situations. And I think there can be some political opportunism that goes on in terms of people want us to live in sort of an idealized or promote an idealized version because they don't want to look at the practice reality. The practice reality is tough to look at sometimes. It's difficult. The goal of trying to create a more stable society, functionalism, or create a more equitable society, conflict theory, has to be done through this idea that we're moving towards understanding practice reality. That's a must in sort of moving forward. All right, with that, I'm going to sign off. Wish you well. Have a great, wonderful day, night, and I look forward to reading your papers, and I'll check in with you sometime soon. Thanks.